Hi and Assalamualaikum. Today we're going to talk about radiation and the routes of transmission and the health effects towards exposed communities. Presenting to you is my group members, starting with me, Muhammad Danish Shishban bin Abdul Rashid, Zakwan bin Iskandar, Anis Sofia binti Abdul Walid, and Nur Safia Hildina. Content, we are going to go through the definition of radiation, the source of radiation in a community, the categories of exposures, the health effects to communities, how do we control, and also the radiation protection program.
We will begin with the definition of radiation. Definition of radiation is the energy that reaches the atmosphere and appears as particle or wave is known as radiation. The transfer of quantum energy to a medium by means of particle or electromagnetic radiation, which has the power to change the medium it absorbs. Next is a source of radiation in a community, which has two types of source of radiation, which is natural and man-made. For natural radiation, it has two types, which is cosmic and terrestrial. For cosmic, usually it came from the sun, the outer space, and also gamma. And for the terrestrial radiation known as source in the earth crust, which you can find in the building material, soil, drinking water, decay product, and also radon gas. Next is man-made radiation that will divide to varieties of source. The first one is medical. For example, X-ray. X-ray are a type of radiation commonly found in the hospital. These radiation are produced mainly by machine when high voltage electron interact with a metal. X-ray are a type of energy similar to light, but like a gamma ray pass easily through fairly thick material. Second one is atmospheric testing fallout, like a nuclear weapon. The third is industrial source. Radiation has a variety of industrial use, for example like smoke detector, smartphone, microwave, electrical power line, and some glow-in-the-dark designs. Last but not least, radiation waste disposal.
Moving on to categories of exposure. There are two types of exposure. The first one is occupational exposure, and the second one is public exposure. Occupational exposure divided by two. The first one is external exposure from radiation sources outside the body, such as nuclear reactors or radioactive materials handling and X-ray machines. As for the second one is internal exposure from radioactive materials that have been inhaled, ingested, or absorbed through the skin. As for the public exposure, it is divided by three. The first one is environmental exposure. Naturally happen radioactive materials existing in the environment. For an example, radon gas, cosmic radiation, and radioactive elements in soil and water. For the second one is medical exposure from diagnostic procedures such as X-rays, CT scans, or radiation therapy for cancer treatment. As for the third is from consumer products. From consumer products that contain radioactive materials such as smoke detectors, certain type of anti-static materials, and some of ceramic types.
As for the health effects to community, it is divided into two, which is acute radiation syndrome and the delayed effects of high dose radiation. Basically saying, acute radiation syndrome is when a person is exposed briefly but to a high exposure of radiation. They are highly reactive, it disrupts cellular function, and it is also radiosensitive to tissues. The signs to a person that are exposed to acute radiation syndrome are fatigue, weakness, diarrhea, hair loss, and more. While for the delayed effects of high dose radiation, the main effect is when a person is exposed to a small dose of radiation but for a long period of time. It is called as radiodermatitis, and the signs and symptoms are such as cancer, which is leukemia, thyroid, and lung cancer. It is also depends on the dosage of absorption of energy from the radiation, the type of radiation, which is neutron and alpha particles, are more harmful than X-ray photons. And lastly, organs that are sensitive, which is reproductive tissue, are more sensitive than thyroid. Look at the appendix beside the slide. We have the modes of exposure, which is divided into two again, which is external and internal. External is from outside, such as we're using our phone and we're calling while charging. It's going to expose us to a small dosage of exposure to radiation, but since we use it for a prolonged period of time, it will affect us eventually. So, meanwhile, the internal exposure is if we inhale, which is breathing in, if we ingest, which is eating, and those are the type of examples of radiation a person can get affected with, such as iodine, cesium, plutonium, which is quite famous in movies, and they will affect the lung, liver, and bones. And also, there's a picture of a person going through an MRI machine, which is a very excruciating time because you have to stay still for a long period of time in a machine. So this is also a small dosage of radiation, but in a long term, so it will not affect us. We are going to split again into two, which is ionizing radiation when it affects the community. So the first one is somatic effects, which is the damage appears in the irradiated person, which means it is physical, qualitative effect to a person. It is divided into two, which is acute and chronic, which is the same thing as before. We're just going to elaborate a bit more. And as in acute, it occurs if an individual again receive a high dose of radiation within a short period of time, and then the severity of symptoms increases with dose above some clinical threshold. That specific thing we refer as non-stochastic or deterministic effect. And then for the chronic effect, it occurs if an individual receives a low dose of radiation within a long period of time and has a long-term effect. And we have some examples of a person's skin burning for a long period of time until they lost their hand. Meanwhile, for the genetic effects, it arises only in the offspring of the irradiated person. It doesn't affect the person who gets the radiation, it affects the offspring, the son, the daughter, the children. So it can damage future generation through appearances of mutations in the offspring of the exposee. Genetic effects is due to damage to the reproductive cells. As I said before, the reproductive cells are more sensitive than the thyroid, saying that it will affect our reproductive system more than our throat. Then the effects, the stochastic effect, which is there is no known threshold of dose and every radiation exposure, which means it does not matter how much dosage we accept, we got, we will eventually get the genetic effects. And no matter how small the radiation, it will contribute into the pool of mutation of the offspring, saying that again, it does not matter how much or how little we were exposed to radiation. If we were, it will eventually affect us. So radiation will eventually affect our lifestyle in the long run. And we have an example, the effects of radiation from head to toe.
So, for control measures, to reduce doses from intake of radioactive substance, the following basic countermeasures can be considered in shortening time of exposure of contaminants, preventing surface of exposure contaminants, preventing surface contamination, preventing inhalation of radioactive materials in air, and preventing investigation of contaminated foodstuffs and drinking water. So, what are the basic measures in radiation protection? So, first is shortening the time of exposures, increasing distance from a radiation sources, and shielding are the basic countermeasures for protective measures to reduce doses from external exposure. The less time that people are exposed to a radiation source, the less they absorb dose, and distance the further away that people are from a radiation source, the less the absorbed dose. And shielding also, barriers of lead, concrete, or water can stop radiation or reduce radiation intensity. So, for next radiation protection program, developing and implementing a comprehensive radiation protection program is an important best practice. This program should be managed by a qualified radiation safety officer (RSO), typically an expert health physicist. Another recommended best practice is establishing a radiation safety committee. This committee should consist of the radiation safety officer, a representative from management, workers who routinely work with radiation producing equipment, radiation sources, or radioactive materials, and those at risk of occupational exposure. The Radiation Protection Program and the Radiation Safety Committee work together to ensure proper protocols, training, monitoring, and oversight. Engineering controls are essential for maintaining occupational radiation doses as low as reasonably achievable (ALARA) after ensuring compliance with regulatory dose limits. Organizations should implement the following engineering controls to the greatest extent possible. First, shielding incorporating appropriate shielding materials such as lead, concrete as or specialized plastics between radiation sources and workers to reduce or eliminate radiation exposure. Second, interlock system, employing interlock system that automatically shut down or secure radiation sources when an area is accessed or a barrier is breached. And third is radioactive material contaminant, incorporating radioactive material contaminant within shielding structures, such as in gamma cameras used in nuclear medicine or industrial radiography devices housing radioactive sources. Engineering Second is administrative controls are implemented to supplement engineering controls in managing radiation exposures, risk areas with appropriate warning signs, and implementing system to alert workers. And second is written operating procedures, establishing detailed standard operating procedures (SOP) for both normal operations and emergency situation. And last is regulatory requirements, complying with administrative control measures specified in applicable OSHA ionizing radiation standards for worksite dealing with radiation sources. Second is administrative controls are implemented to supplement engineering controls in managing radiation exposures, risk areas with appropriate warning signs, and implementing system to alert workers. And second is written operating procedures, establishing detailed standard operating procedures (SOP) for both normal operations and emergency situation. And last is regulatory requirements. So, lastly is personal protective equipment (PPE) is used to prevent workers from becoming contaminated with radioactive materials. Its primary purpose it is So first is prevent skin contamination from particulate radiation, alpha and beta particles, and second, prevent inhalation of radioactive materials. It is important to note that standard PPE does not protect workers from direct external radiation exposures, such as standing in an X-ray, and also when selecting PPE and developing a PPE policy for radiation environments, it is crucial to consult with qualified experts such as head physicists. In line with the hierarchy of control, PPE should only be used when engineering controls or administrative controls are not feasible or insufficient. Proper use of PPE combined with other
For the radiation protection program is 1. Policy, 2. Standard for equipment and radiation dose limits. New equipment subjected to prior radiological assessment and utilize of radiation dose rate monitors. Third is written procedures. The fourth is hierarchy of control measures such as minimizing exposure time, using shielding, maintaining distance, enclosures and segregation, use of personal protective equipment PPE, engineering control measure, and maintenance and inspection. As for the fifth is training for competent personnel for radiographers, X-ray operators, and radiation protection officers. As for the sixth is radiation safety audits, the seventh emergency planning, and the eighth is risk communication.